All right. Well, I'm going to kick it off. Good afternoon, and thank you, Asa, for having me today. And I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, so good afternoon from here, good morning wherever you are, or good evening. And today I'm going to be discussing a case study, like Asif said, of what it's like to migrate from SharePoint on premises to SharePoint Online. And this doesn't get too technical because you really do need to go through some of the business processes ahead of time, but it did really happen. The impacts were quantifiable from multiple viewpoints, both from a money standpoint, how much the service cost, how much it costs to keep it up afterwards, and including some disaster recovery things for you to learn from later on in the session. So this is somewhat on the basic from a business standpoint viewpoint, but I will get into a little bit more of the examples of specifics, especially at the end. I have some lessons learned because there were definitely some potholes and maybe even some landmines along the way when we were doing this, and this was the first time for me to ever do a migration like this at the time, so hopefully you walk away with some good lessons learned from this. Okay, so my background, I actually my career started in 2009. I started working for a Navy contractor. We actually designed all the nuclear reactors for the U.S. Navy. I'm actually an IT guy by mistake. I started out for about 3 years as a mechanical engineer, but SharePoint 2007 rolled out to about 15,000 users in that network. We were the contractor, but we ran the network for the government agency. The government agency was actually on that system with us. We were air-gapped. We had no easy access to the internet on the outside for most of the time that I was there. That was getting better over time, but I was still sort of the SharePoint whisperer, I guess I'll say, because I was the one that took the information from the internet and provided some internal help resources. So I actually created a central website that I called SharePoint Center or SharePoint Central. I put out newsletters to my site owners. Our site owners had to be qualified, that kind of thing. But I sort of fell into this by mistake because I started with SharePoint 2007 when it rolled out. I was an engineer. We had a bunch of documents we needed to organize because the intranet was actually being retired and replaced by SharePoint. So I will say one upside to when you do a migration or an upgrade is force it. Because then adoption isn't nearly as hard to get people to bring along to your new system. But since we were losing our old basically web-based internet, various people had licenses to Dreamweaver, things like that. IT asked me to jump in and help out because I had put together some really good resources that example use cases essentially that other teams in the organization could benefit from. So it was a lot of users, like I said, 15,000. SharePoint 2007 came out in 2010. And then I also oversaw the user side, the adoption side of SharePoint 2013 upgrade. We did that in late 2014. And with SharePoint 2013 comes the newsfeed. And when you take thousands of engineers who are always the smartest people in the world, never wrong, cynical, cheap, all those things put together. If there's any engineers out there, I am also an engineer, so I can say that. The social experience is very interesting because we definitely had to get some moderation in there that we didn't really expect. Let's see, after that, I decided for a bit of a career change, or at least location change, and I spent about 2 years working for a healthcare consulting firm in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I was on the island of St. Thomas. I like to tell people I was one of the top 2 SharePoint administrators there because the only other one worked for the government of the Virgin Islands at the time. And this is the case study that I'm talking about today, was what I was given, what the decision was for moving forward, why we made that decision, how I got it through all of my layers of management, then through the C-suite, what the strategy was to get that stuff passed through, and how we actually implemented it, what some of those lessons learned were, and what some of the impacts were later on. These days, I moved back to the States in about a year ago. It was March 2017. I now work for a consulting company called H3 Solutions. My 2 previous positions were internal positions. I was a dedicated resource to both of those companies. Even though I worked for a healthcare consulting firm, we consulted outside of us, and I was actually for the internal folks. And some of the things that I learned there were really how business processes can be applied or simplified or made more efficient using things like SharePoint, Office 365. I will say I didn't even know what Office 365 was until I got to the company in the Virgin Islands because I never had access to a 365 account prior because we were on an on-prem SharePoint 2013 environment. So this whole concept of the cloud was brand new to me. The amount of research that I did was just a lot of time for me to really understand it and get to know it. And even then, there were still plenty of things I didn't expect that came through later on. that were learning experiences unto themselves. These days I consult for Office 365 for clients who are either migrating to, need governance, use cases, how to better manage or get the most value out of their 365 subscriptions. I've done a bunch of security and compliance things recently with clients, and actually my company just rolled out what we consider to be one of the first or primary bot as a service tools out there. So basically we give you a pre-built bot that you can then teach how to do business processes, teach to give answers to questions that people have regularly, and to provide an easy way for the bot to understand what people are saying in natural language. So I'll show you a little bit about that. Not too much, I'm not trying to product place here, but the bot thing is coming, whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not, and we provide sort of the SharePoint of bot platforms. So in my 2 years at the USVI, I was given when I got there, I was given a SharePoint 2013 system and told that I had to do something with it, essentially. We ended up choosing to migrate it to SharePoint Online, but the thing is, when you migrate to SharePoint Online, you're not really migrating to SharePoint Online. You're migrating to Office 365, which is significantly larger than SharePoint Online. So in addition to SPO, I also became the unexpected or, surprised father of SharePoint, but OneDrive for Business, Yammer, mobile access, security, and a number of the other apps that come with the Office 365 suite, which I hadn't really expected, because once you provide the app launcher in 365 to people, they now have a bunch of buttons that they can press for other things. So you're not just supporting, maintaining, or pushing adoption for Office 365 or for SharePoint Online. Anything else that they might be using, that they might need, you're going to be supporting that too. We had a dedicated Exchange team, so all of the buttons to in the app launcher that go towards Outlook was supported by somebody else. But I never really envisioned I was going to be the owner of a video portal internally, right? So at the time it was Office 365 Video. Today it's Stream. So yeah, that's something you have to keep in mind when you go through with this. So our mission was to upgrade SharePoint. We weren't told how. It was either we were going to go to the cloud or we were going to upgrade to SharePoint 2016. And the system that I got, this is essentially what we migrated. There were a number of key aspects to it. So it was a SharePoint 2013 on-prem system. The support was me. I was the knowledge manager / SharePoint administrator. I had 3 developers or / administrators who worked for me offshore in India, and we had some infrastructure supports from some of my colleagues that also sat in the same building with me. The servers were in our building. I'll show you a little bit later on why that matters. And I don't really touch servers. I've never actually really touched the physical side of putting an IT system together before. I'm very much a GUI guy, and I'll do command line stuff if I have to, but I'll probably do it kicking and screaming. So having that support from those guys who actually had put together all those racks, had set them up, were in charge of the firewalls, load balancers, things like that, that was all on those guys. I was the guy that interfaced the software with the users who we were trying to get to start using that, because almost everybody was using their content management systems were a mixture of shared drives, personal drives, hard drives, floppy disks, the USB drives, that kind of thing. So that was important because we had 4 full-time people here plus some added infrastructure support. We had 4 environments. We had dev, test, staging, and prod, which I learned at the time. I didn't know this beforehand. That's sort of the standard best practice for setting up your SharePoint or plenty of other development realms. And we had about 40 gig of data. It was not very big. It grew substantially after we got the migration because then people started using it. At the time, it was really just an intranet, and some people were kind of using it a lot more than others, so there wasn't a whole lot of data being used. But it's still applicable to know how that was going. We had some custom solutions and some SharePoint Designer solutions, and that's important because you actually have to kind of set those aside and work on them separately to make sure that you can get them up. Sometimes that actually impacts the timing on when you get to actually shut down the old system, because that system can easily be kept up or held up essentially because the applications that take too long to rebuild, or because SharePoint Designer is not as easy or applicable to use in SharePoint Online, things like that. So here are some of the risks that came with our system and some of the reasons why we were really looking at doing this. First off, we had no disaster recovery system for SharePoint. That was not the case for a lot of the other systems. Exchange on-prem had a disaster recovery system, but this was really one of the drivers for why we wanted to upgrade. And if we're going to upgrade, what that then told us what we had to do when it comes to DR. So if we're going to upgrade to 2016, we'd have to create a separate disaster recovery system elsewhere. But if we upgraded or uploaded everything into the cloud, it kind of has an inherent disaster recovery system. Now that's not 100% accurate, but for the need that we had, the high value of boom, here you go, you just got a de facto DR system built in, that was very handy. Like I said, our content management was all over the place. People were keeping files everywhere. There was no central search service that would actually get you a good result for things you were looking for. And we had no retention rules put in place. So there were documents that were dating back to when the company started in 2008. A couple of the oldest employees, or the longest lasting employees at the company at that time, one of them had more than a terabyte worth of email. You know, it was a lot of data that was scattered all over the place. Generally speaking, we were a Microsoft shop, but we had a marketing department, so of course they had some Macs there. They actually had their own server for keeping their files so that they could do all of their creative design work on their Macs, but generally speaking, we were a Microsoft shop. We also had 4 buildings across 3 campuses, so that's important to point out that we were physically separated across the island. And just for reference, we weren't really using any sort of enterprise social network at the time, so even though SharePoint 2013 provides the news feed, we didn't use that at all. Yammer was available at the time. Interestingly, our O365 license came with our SharePoint license, or at least that's what we like to say. Realistically, it was actually the other way around. We wanted SharePoint, and the new license was, here's O365, and by the way, we'll include SharePoint for free. So we had all this stuff available to us, just nobody was using it yet. So nobody had any idea that Yammer existed at the time, for example. So let's talk about the workloads. At the time, we were using Office 365 E4 licenses. They were eventually upgraded to E5 because E4 doesn't exist anymore. That was retired. Like I said, we had Exchange on-prem, and that was supported by a separate team. We were using Dynamics CRM Online, so we were actually already in the cloud, in the Office 365 cloud actually at the time, even though many wouldn't have known that. And for this project, we actually used ShareGate Lite. The 40 gigs made it so that it was easy for us to use ShareGate, which is pretty simple to just swipe a credit card and say, here's that tool. That being said, if you have a larger system, you're going to probably want to look at something more hardcore. There are plenty of other third-party migration tools out there. I think my big takeaway for you here is that I think it's really not smart to try to do this without a third-party tool. So as you start going through the process of deciding how much it's going to cost, when you budget both manpower and dollars, make sure you include the cost for what a third-party migration tool would cost, because some of them can be reasonably expensive, and they're very good at what they do, but they come at a price, and the whole point is that you want to have this migration be as minimally impactful on your users as possible. With ShareGate and 40 gigs and our site structure being pretty straightforward, the migration was relatively easy for us. We, prior to my arrival, most of the added cost or man hours that were spent on anything special for SharePoint were being used on applications and SharePoint Designer solutions, and not so much on building a very massive, wide-ranging, site template, really complex system like that. So ShareGate was good enough for us in this situation. We had 175 employees, also notable for some metrics, so you have an idea of what we were working with here. So the decision process is really where it comes in. This is where I'm going to say most of my time was spent across the whole project. Where do we go from here? We had to decide whether we're going to use SharePoint 2016 and just upgrade, or we're going to actually migrate. Right. So our directive, we were a consulting firm, which is true. But we actually were a sister company of our main client. So one of the big things that we did on the IT side of things was that we were there to test out new technologies, new systems, new options, solutions, whatever term you want to use there, see how they work at our level in a small company of 175, and then figure out whether or not they can be applied and scaled to the larger sister company. The larger sister company was a hospital system, about 6,000 to 7,000 employees. So we could figure out what the right direction was to go for us. It would probably be applicable to them. So that was a big decision for us, because we could have easily gone the 2016 route, but that wouldn't have really been on the leading edge of things to really do that testing and learn from our mistakes if maybe the cloud wasn't the right move and we ended up having to backtrack. We'd rather have us do that than them do that. And since the cloud is pretty much, it's only 2 years later now, is essentially becoming ubiquitous. That's not to say that there aren't tens of thousands of organizations that are still on-prem, because they are and they will be for a while. But the cloud is definitely in your future, even if you don't realize it yet. So the fact that we had the opportunity to jump on 365 when it was still, I think it's been around for 6 years now, but the real functionality of it has really come out only in the last 2, 3, 4 years. And especially in the last year or two since I started this project, the amount of information, best practices, use cases, and especially just organizing the resource information has really increased and gotten a lot better. So I think it's beyond its sort of its infant stage, and really has gotten to be more of a straight up, this is a solution and it's going to save us time and money. So that had a lot to do with why we ended up going with the cloud. So I had to do a lot of research. Like I said, reading about it now is much better. Back then content was scattered all over the place. The people who wrote blogs, the community influencers, the names haven't changed a whole lot from then, but the amount of content that's out there, lessons learned, best practices have become more vast and much more organized. So it's a lot easier to get an idea of what you should be doing. We had to lay out the project plan. I was a project manager before I left the Navy contractor. I was doing both adoption and project leading projects at the IT side. So having those skills was useful. Then I had to make the business case to our CIO, and then after that, I had to go up to the C-level, get them all to the C-suite to get them all to give the approval, especially let them all know in a communication-wise, like, hey, we're going to be working on this project now. It's all behind the scenes. I'm going to need some dedicated resources, not a lot, but like 5-10%. My champion in each department is going to have to help out with getting this stuff going. And then we had to do some test migrations and then a real migration. So let's talk about the business case, though. Why even consider the cloud? So first, let's define the cloud, because I think that this term is something that almost nobody can answer fully correctly, because nobody can actually understand the full concept. And also, if you ever go to conference sessions where they talk about cloud or Office 365, I have a lot of fun by asking everybody, raise your hand and give me a definition of what the cloud is. You get 3, 4, 5, 6 people answer. Every single one of them is different. And sometimes you'll actually get disagreements because they'll have their own reasons why. So I actually want to take a second here to define the cloud. At least for me, my perspective when it comes to Office 365 specifically. Okay, so this is an infographic Asif referenced earlier. I put this together about a little bit under a year ago because it was so difficult explaining what Office 365 is to people. It's not just Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, right? It's not just Mail or Outlook if that happens to be the tool that you use most. It is a way more than that. And depending on your license type, it's going to include more or less of these apps, but these are the main apps that come with an Office 365 license. You see a little dollar sign on the top right of some of them because those are premium products like Dynamics, Project, Visio. But it's really hard to tell people, sort of the biggest question you'll ever get is going to be the when to use what. And I've grouped these based on what most of them do. So you'll see, I identify here that Delve is both, because it provides profile pages like LinkedIn does, and People and Outlooks are, two things that are both in employee profiles. Microsoft Forms and Microsoft Power Apps both do forms in their own different way. So being able to group these things together so people can understand what they are, I think is important. There's a link on the bottom right down there you can see if you want to check this out. There's actually a dynamic version that you can click. We'll open up a short description on each app so you can understand what that is. We have instructions on how to embed it if you want to put it in your SharePoint site so people can learn from it from there, so you don't have to go off and do this yourself. But anyway, I just want to talk about, when I refer to the cloud, at least in this case, I'm talking about this Office 365 layout here that you see of the apps that you could get depending on which license that you get. I will toss in just one small thing in addition to this. We were really interested in what Office 365 groups could do for us. One of our lessons learned I'll talk about later was that you need to have Exchange Online mailboxes enabled in Office 365. So we hadn't planned on that. We didn't know it was a requirement, so we couldn't actually get the benefit out of groups at the time. But groups are very confusing, if not one of the most confusing aspects right now for any administrator and even for a user. But once they're set up correctly for a team or an organization of people that have a common goal and a project end date, that kind of thing, it is so easy to use with some of the best communication methods that are available now. File storage is super simple. So I just wanted to show you here that these are the three main types of groups that you can create, what you get when you create a group, and what happens to them later on. So again, there's a link on the bottom right. Feel free to go to that later on. This is only one small part of a much longer infographic that kind of goes over the basics of creating any one of these. So I think that groups is one of the best features that Office 365 offers for the just get stuff done feature set these days. And if you're going to do that and take advantage of it, which you should, you're going to want to know how they work and what happens when you go after one. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the business case now. I split this up between two ways, right? One is for IT. Why did IT want to go to the cloud? And then what's in it for the users? Why would the users want to go to the cloud? So for IT, I have a whole bunch here I want to cover with you so you understand what you're going to get out of this deal. First off, for us, like I said, disaster recovery was a huge deal for us. So you get inherent disaster recovery. I have a blog post out there on all the recovery options that you have in SharePoint Online and OneDrive that I think is important for everybody to understand, because actual recovery, if you delete something and it goes into the recycle bin and it's been there for 30 days and then it's been in the backup recycle bin for another 60 days, after that 90-day period, theoretically it's gone. But you could actually ask Microsoft to restore it. But there is no like central admin button that you had on-prem where you can just restore a library or restore a file. Actual restoration is by site collection, which can be dangerous if, say, your intranet is all in one site collection. But the fact that it's not something where you have to have one server rack in Florida and another server rack in Washington State because you need to have that disaster recovery where if one gets destroyed, the other one's still available. High access availability is always going to be there. Minimized administration effort. Like I said, I'm not an IT guy. I don't code, I don't dev. I hadn't actually pressed any SharePoint administration buttons while I was with the Navy. It wasn't until I took this job in the VI where I did get those buttons, and it didn't take much for me to learn that. And by the way, it wasn't just SharePoint. I got all the buttons and all the rest of the apps, and they're actually pretty easy to use. So even a guy who hadn't been trained on this stuff and never really had a whole lot of experience with it was able to take over pretty quickly. No patching downtime. I remember having to do a patch on Christmas Day of 2015, so I don't ever have to do that again, which is great. You get security improvements. I'm going to talk about security a lot today because that's one of the biggest stepping stones or, barriers that people automatically assume that Office 365 and any sort of cloud solution is going to be less secure than what you could do locally because you can make it the way you need to. I think that that's incorrect and a false assumption these days. For our perspective, the centralization of services under one contract was super useful. Everything just got merged, so from an administrative standpoint, that was nice. You get that 3.9 uptime guarantee, so that's 99.9% is the SLA, at least on SharePoint. Other tools have different uptime guarantees. Fun story, though, if you ever do the math out on that, that 0.1% is about 8 hours per year, so you're actually only paying for, or getting Office 364 for the price of Office 365. But that being said, the actual uptime that they've been seeing is 5 nines, so 99.999%, so that's pretty good. Let's see, almost no hardware support, which is great. Now, granted, you'll be providing your users a lot more mobile access, so that is new hardware. So if you don't have a BYOD policy, a bring your own device policy, you're going to want one. Content's wipeable from those devices, which is nice. So if somebody loses their laptop, you can get all that stuff off of there, and whoever stole it or if whoever found it wouldn't have the opportunity necessarily to see any sort of IP or any security or secure data. Same with mobile devices. In fact, you can just wipe the user's work content from a personal phone if that's something that your BYOD policy includes. I think what's pleasantly surprising also is that the mobile, you can actually administer Office 365 from your mobile phone. There is an admin center app, and you can get alerts for, hey, SharePoint's going to be down, or it's currently out for the next 30 minutes, something like that. You can actually get a notification. So I got a question here. Isn't content wipeable dependent on additional services? So yes, it can be. There are different levels of how much freedom you have or how much extensibility you have. So out of the box, like an E5 license or E3 license, both provide wipeable features. You want to look into Microsoft Intune, though, I'd say is something you want to check out. More features and tools with time. I mean, when I first started using Office 365, Microsoft Teams didn't exist, and now it does, and it actually is one of my favorite apps that Microsoft has ever put out before, and we don't have to pay anything more for that tool. That comes out automatically. Microsoft Stream is reasonably new. It's going to be replacing Microsoft, the Office 365 video service, the Microsoft Graph, and sort of the best way of experiencing that is through Delve, Office Delve. Those things came out of quote-unquote nowhere. So those services are pretty cool, and the fact that you get more for your dollar later on is really nice. So I'm going to talk about in the disaster recovery thing here, because I think this is a big one and it really shows the value for why we needed to do this. So if you don't know where the U.S. Virgin Islands are, they're in the Caribbean. You may have actually stopped right by my office before. If you've been on a cruise of the Eastern Caribbean, St. Thomas is actually the most visited cruise port in the Caribbean. It's just east of Puerto Rico. I could actually see Puerto Rico from my apartment. I lived up on top of the hill. But this is important for a number of reasons, geographically, but also for some other reasons too. That being natural disasters. There are a lot of natural disasters that can happen there that I did not learn or realize until I moved. Now, this map you're looking at is the hurricane, the historical hurricane track map, and you can see the little Google Map pointer there. That's where St. Thomas is, so you get a lot of hurricanes to go through. The first time I ever gave this session, it was easy to point out here that in 1995, Hurricane Marilyn came through. And this is an experience that the locals there talk about in the same way that, one remembers where they were when Kennedy was shot or when 9/11 happened, except this lasted for months with no power. Recovery was slow. They actually had to redo their building codes, so there are no wood stick structures any longer. Everything has to be concrete and reinforced, which is good, but, they had to learn from that in that process. And think about this is 95, this is before the internet was really a thing. I don't even think they had any lines going out to St. Thomas at that point, so communication was really, really tough. Now that's one thing, but then think about in the last few months, I have a feeling you've heard about Hurricanes Irma and Maria. Down there, it's actually the term for it is #Irmaria. It was all one experience for them because I don't think they had gained power back after Irma before Maria came through. This picture here is actually a friend of mine's house. The front was a sliding door, and the back where you see the water, that was also a sliding door. The front sliding door blew out through the back sliding door, and that landed into, if you know St. Thomas at all, that's actually Megan's Bay behind there. They lived on a cliff essentially. They didn't own the house; they rented it. Homeowners insurance covered it. They were not in the house when this happened. Actually, the husband in that relationship was the CIO of the local hospital, so they stayed at the hospital. My colleague was his wife; she was a developer on my team. So this really kind of hit home for me because it really had an impact on what was going to happen in St. Thomas, especially after I had left there. Another thing outside of the hurricanes I didn't realize was that it's actually a very high active seismic zone. Now, I've always lived in the east coast of the U.S. where seismic earthquakes are not really a thing for us, at least not big ones. I've studied them because I'm a civil engineering graduate, so we had to design for seismic activity, but that was not something that really mattered much to me. Now, I did get to check that box off my bucket list that I think it was a 4.2 that woke me up at like 6:30 in the morning one morning, so I can say I've been in I've been in an earthquake, but it didn't cause much or just rattled some dishes. That was about it. But it's not just that. When you have earthquakes near the ocean, you have tsunamis. So this is a sign that was actually right next door to our office. And if you have an earthquake, you damn well better be ready to run uphill very quickly. So you have a lot of threats from all different points. And now this is a view of what it looks like when you fly out of St. Thomas. In the front center here is St. Thomas. Behind that is Tortola, part of the British Virgin Islands, and to the back right is St. John, one of the most beautiful places on earth. You should go there sometime. But my office was under the right arrow, and that's about 6 feet above sea level. So I had, earthquakes, I had seawater, salt water that was a threat after an earthquake, and I had fresh water that was a threat from the sky. So one notable outcome of Hurricane Irma for these guys was that their Exchange servers were damaged during this. Now, they had backups in Chicago, but as many people don't do when they have DR systems, they don't test them out as often as they probably should. And getting those hooked back up was not as easy as it could be. And I was talking to a couple buddies of mine after, a month or two afterwards, and I said, cheekily, how's SharePoint doing? Which they both rolled their eyes at me because it was doing perfectly fine, of course. Okay, and then another thing for us was the utilities. So we had one energy company, and we had two ISPs, and actually the two ISPs were migrating or merging, just like a couple of them were up here. So WAPA, the Water and Power Authority, was a four-letter word, both figuratively and literally. We didn't have power all the time, so it was easier for you to get access to some of your mobile data or your data from your mobile device if the power was out, and there's only so much diesel gas you can have for a generator. And the ISPs, we had redundancy until they merged, then we didn't have redundancy, so that was a big deal too. So anyway, these are some of the things that were important to us going through here. Now I'm going to jump into here the users, why the users would care for having a cloud service. First off, external user access I thought was going to be icing on the cake. It was not. It was the cake, and all the other stuff was the icing. So the fact that you could share files externally with your client and have them edit it without having to have a license was a big deal. The mobile access is also a big deal because you can actually, instead of having to find that agenda for a meeting that you're going to, without having to open your laptop up, hope that the Wi-Fi in the new building that you're at a meeting for will actually connect and then get the document opened. That's not an issue. If you have your phone and some cell service, you can easily open up that file. Word or OneDrive would tell you it was one of the more recent files you opened, so it should be easy to get. The internal video portal was also popular. No VPN required if you don't want to. Unlike a lot of other systems where you actually do have to VPN to the local system to get access to things like shared drives, you don't have to do that to get Office 365. You can choose to if you want to because you think it's a security concern, but that's up to you. Huge file size support, 15 gigabytes. I actually had some people that sent exe files to our clients because there's no better way to do it, because at the time they were actually going to buy an SD card from the local Kmart and then save the file on the SD card and then FedEx it over to the recipient. So it's amazing that, in 2016 anybody would ever have to do that, but except for SharePoint Online and OneDrive, this was the only other option that they really had. You get the 5 licenses to Office, so actually for everyday employees, this is actually kind of a nice little employee benefit. If they don't already have Office at home, they can use one of their work licenses to install it on their home computer. The user interface, SharePoint Modern, not even considering that, just the classic sites on SPO are significantly better even than SharePoint 2013 sites. So keep that in mind too. No patching or upgrade downtime for them. So like when I did my patching on Christmas Day, I did it on Christmas Day for a reason. But even if somebody had to get on, they wouldn't be able to for a couple-hour period while we're doing some patches or some upgrades, so you don't have to worry about that ever. OneDrive for Business, the fact that they get a terabyte or even unlimited space on a business account is amazing, especially because it's so easy to use for sharing. Expertise location with Delve, if you have to find out who's really good at project management, or you want to know who's the Excel expert in your organization, if they put their information in Delve, you can find out who those people are. So those are the reasons why you would consider going to the cloud, both from IT and from the user side. Now let's talk about some of the risks here. And there are risks. There is no perfect solution for you regardless of where you are and what organization type that you work in, so you have to consider both sides, right? And some of these disadvantages aren't trivial. Okay, so first one is keeping up with changes. This is going to affect anybody that works in the Office 365 sphere. Keeping up with changes is getting easier, but it is difficult. Microsoft puts out updates and communications in numerous places, one of them being the Message Center and the Admin Center. There is no easy way to necessarily get just the stuff that you want to see, so they'll send you out everything that would affect your system, even if it's something that you don't really care about. Reading blog posts, going to things like Microsoft Ignite, or just following along with that, following the right people on Twitter. It's sort of you got to know the way to keep up on what's going on, and you almost have to know the names sometimes, right? I actually skipped custom solutions. That is also a risk, because if that's the majority of what your SharePoint on-prem system is, then you're going to have multiple projects just to figure out how to replace those, because rebuilding solutions and custom developed tools in SharePoint Online is not nearly as easy. You can build things like Azure web apps, but you're still going to have to learn how to do that and rebuild it in that new system. So that's important to keep an eye on as you start developing your business requirements. You're supporting more systems, as I've said, so that whole periodic table, you're getting a whole bunch of new apps. Your performance might be slower, okay? And then external sharing is super confusing. Unfortunately, they've made it more less confusing over time, but it's still confusing, and it's kind of a shame. I actually give a separate 1-hour session just on external sharing, because admins have to know how to do that, and when people want to share externally, it can't just be an ad hoc decision. It's not just like attaching an email or a document to an email. You actually have to be strategic about how you're doing it. Do I put all these files into a folder and share the folder instead of all of the files? Things like that, right? And then security is the big one at the end, of course. So with the custom solutions, you actually have to develop within Microsoft parameters. I have a situation where we built a custom global navigation bar. It worked for 8 months, and then out of nowhere, one day it stopped working. Microsoft moved the goalposts on us. So it was unfortunate that we followed the rules, and even then, they decided that the system that they had set up was a little bit too lenient, and they had to, lock some things down, and that actually caused us a problem. So you may have to rebuild these. They may not work at all. I think it's a really good opportunity to reconsider whether or not some of these applications even need to be in existence. So do not just do a Xerox copy of what you had before just because that's what people are asking for. Be smart about it. Use it as an opportunity to scale down, slim down, become a little bit less bureaucratic if you need to, and only do what you really need to do to make this thing work right in the future. Like I said, keeping up with the changes, these are the types of resources that I pay attention to regularly. The Office blog especially, the Microsoft Tech community especially, the Office 365 roadmap, which changes pretty frequently, and a number of other websites, events. I follow a number of people on Twitter. You're going to have to start doing the same if you don't already do that. So supporting more systems, like I said, this is your Office 365 system. You are now the proud owner of all of these things. Even though things like Skype for Business, like that is its own entity, Outlook as Exchange is its own entity, SharePoint and OneDrive are its own entity as well. But things like Word Online, all the online versions of the Office apps, that's new. You still have to support putting out client apps though as well. And then, To-Do, Planner, those are new apps. Planner's only been around for 2 years. To-Do is still brand new. I know it's based off of Wunderlist, but still. So that's something to keep in mind. Your performance. I say it might be slower. I'm going to say it probably will be, depending on how you're physically located. On-prem systems are likely faster because you actually have a direct connection. So you definitely want to do some math. Try it out. Do some testing of what a site in your on-prem system is. Check out how many milliseconds is taking to reach, or even more, and quantify that. Then migrate or copy that same site into SharePoint Online and see what kind of response time you get for that. Figure out whether, I think for us, we did some measurements. It was going to be like 22% slower in SPO. Now, granted, we had to go all the way from the Caribbean up to Florida and then up to Virginia, because I think that's where our main data center was. But is that tolerable? For some people it is, so you have to consider that. And then external sharing, like I said, this is a separate thing that takes a lot of time to really understand. And when people want to do it, they really should have to go through at least a little bit of training or understanding. And I don't know, perhaps Asif has some in-context training for that available in SharePoint, maybe even OneDrive. But that's the kind of thing that it's super tempting, but it's super easy to get caught up with, because people just quote unquote expect it to work, and it doesn't always do that. Now the big one here is security. Okay, I ran into issues here when I was going through our planning process, and it was the I don't trust the cloud. I was actually not allowed to use the word cloud outside of IT because that word was too tainted with potentially higher ups elsewhere in the company. They didn't need to have that detail, which I totally get, but at the same time, I'm one that, like, when I'm going to make a recommendation, I think it's important for my colleagues or the people making the decisions to understand what they're getting themselves into. But I like to point out very quickly, whenever anybody said I don't trust the cloud, well, you do though, because we're already using a number of cloud services. We're already in Dynamics CRM, Dynamics 365 essentially. That was for all of our customer relationship management. We were using Alfresco, which is actually a SharePoint Online competitor at the time. ADP, that's where all of our employee information was, our tax returns, our paychecks, and Concur, that was for all of our expenses. So those two right there, as a person myself, like, I care more about the fact that you have all of my personal data in those two things, and that I want to get paid, right? That's definitely a priority in my life. So the fact that you've already moved something that was so money-based into a cloud service, and this is, I'm going to say with air quotes, just data, was something that I don't think people realize until you kind of bring it up as they make questions. We were also heavy users of Evernote until I started introducing people to OneNote after that. And Cornerstone was actually our learning management system, so that was all on a cloud service. And then you might be using some of these. So if you're using Box or Dropbox for file storage, or if you're using Google Apps, MailChimp, Hootsuite for marketing, Slack if you haven't gotten on the Teams yet, and then Salesforce is, I believe it's bigger than Dynamics actually. So that's a large number of people out there that are already using cloud services. So if you're really that concerned about a cloud service, and you're using these, either you went through a pretty serious review process already, which you can maybe jump on that and use it as a template for developing your justification, that this one gives you, that kind of opportunity. And then I also like to point out sort of a real-world use case of a cloud service that we've all been using for centuries, and that's called a bank, right? You keep money in a bank because you don't want to keep paper currency in a mattress someplace, because if the house burns down or somebody breaks in and steals it, all that kind of stuff. The fact that people are so scared of the cloud because I don't control it any longer is just sort of blasphemous when you just think of this everyday thing that is a bank, and how you put money in it, you don't know where it goes, but you know when you go back there, you're going to get it back. And at least if you live in the US, theoretically, yes, you could, a bank can go out of business, but you do have insurance from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Now, there's not really a one-to-one comparison on the data side of things from Microsoft, but if your company keeps all of its money, which I'm sure it does, keeps it in a bank, why is your data more valuable than your revenue, the money that actually flows through your company or your organization? I think that's important to keep in mind. If you want to read a little bit more about that, I go into some specific examples about why this is important at that link that you see there. That will provide you it's a short link that goes into LinkedIn and an article that I wrote that kind of explains or expands on this topic. But that's one of those ones where people start complaining about the cloud and they sort of stop in their tracks whenever I say, yeah, but you use a bank, don't you? They look at me puzzled, I explain it, and they go, oh, yeah, that's a good point. And it kind of gets me past that standard response. So here are a couple other things that came up during our security reviews. First off, people were concerned that we weren't going to own the data that we uploaded. That is not true. The data is yours, 100%. That is in your SLA. Second, they'll data mine and advertise, like Google does when you have Gmail open and you open up a file or an email from, a Pinterest update, and it tries to start selling you some things on Etsy or something like that. That does not happen either. That's also in your SLA. There is no data mining and no advertising at the individual level, well, at any level for that matter. They can access your stuff. Now, this one is kind of a tough one. Because, yeah, they kind of sort of can, but they shouldn't, and that would be a huge breach of contract and would have to require some sort of conspiracy of a number of people within the Microsoft to do that. But it's the same thing as where a bank could theoretically steal your money. Yeah, they kind of sort of could, but they also wouldn't, because it would take, it would take quite the conspiracy to pull that off by individuals, and the organization as a whole isn't going to be going after you that way. And so this is sort of what the security setup is here. They have a number of physical digital security layers in place. I also like to point out that when people say, yeah, but we can control the security on our on-prem system, that's great. But when you start thinking about it, especially if anybody has to go through budget cuts, the first thing that they always cut, I've seen at least, is going to be professional development, and not being able to get to a conference to find out the next generation, fill in the blank security thing. If you're cutting that money, that person's not getting that information or that learning, so they're not going to be able to apply it. So your security setup is actually going to be worse than it was. Also, assuming that a security team of anywhere between 1 and 10 that you have at your company is going to be the Superman and Wonder Woman of IT security, but local, I think is expecting a little bit more from them than their job titles imply, and probably a little bit more than their pay implies. So the fact that you have a system that is built by literally the people that sort of set the standard for IT security, and who have a very major investment in this and could lose out on a lot if it went wrong because of the public backlash, I think I would rather have my trust put in that sometime in some cases. So I think that's something that you want to consider as you start going through the security review, because yes, you can do a lot of things yourself, but a lot of times you want to have somebody else do it. So the one thing too that people got into, this was actually a big deal for us, was when will they access the content? And they actually don't. Microsoft never has a reason to, unless you have an issue, an actual technical issue, and even then you have to give them certain information to confirm that they even don't have, the tech wouldn't have, to get access to your content. But if there are compelled reasons to access your content, it only comes from law enforcement, from the FISA court, or from national security organizations. So let me dive into that a little bit, because that actually mattered for us, and it does matter for a lot of other organizations. For a law enforcement request, that's only when a warrant or a court order is required. And that's the kind of thing where if they sent it to you because it was on your system on-prem, you'd have to respond to that yourself. So there's no real change in impact there. And some of the interesting data points that come out of here. So the first half of 2016, about 36,000 requests, only 2.5 were granted, which I think is interesting. And then with the FISA and NSL requests, if you're not familiar with the FISA request or FISA court, that's the court that was revealed by Edward Snowden when he released his national security dump back in the day. But they give you a number of how many requests over how many accounts in the first half of 2016. And apparently these are so secret. I came from a realm where I was surrounded by classified data all day long for a number of years, but I think it's funny that they can't even give you an actual number because they are just so secret. Now that being said, Microsoft has acknowledged that they can hand over Office 365 data without your permission because of one of those types of things. They said it sort of in a poking way at the government, which I'm cool with. But they actually sued the government in April 2016 over the issue, which is great, but it's also reasonably cheap to have some lawyers go and sue the government because it buys them some love from their customers that, hey, at least we tried. I will say there was the update, though, in October here that the DOJ did actually do something to curb the overuse of these security orders. I actually have not checked in on what Congress did, but I won't get into politics, but it may not be a whole lot. But with the security aspect of things here, I'm not going to say that none of these concerns are trivial, because they are not. You need to be sure what you're doing, and you really should make sure that you include legal counsel for review. They may not be thrilled to understand or to jump in on this, but they're going to, once you start telling them that data is no longer being held locally, they're going to want to know what you're doing and why you're proposing it. So some resources on security, make sure to check out the Trust Center. You want to look about the Office blog has some security overviews. Look up Customer Lockbox. That's definitely something you want to check out. If you're interested in the accessing of data without your permission, check out the National Security Orders. There's a handout that goes with this whole session. There are links to all of these things, active links that will go there for you, so you don't have to go Googling this. You can find exactly what I'm referring to, and then I'll go out in the email that comes out after this session. And then one last thing about security. I'm very much somebody who believes in practice what you preach, and Microsoft has a great white paper out there about when they migrated 98% of its SharePoint on-prem system into the cloud, including sensitive product and financial information. The 2% that they didn't was actually custom applications and things that weren't ready to go to the cloud yet or had to be rebuilt, and they weren't ready to hold back on that. So I think that's pretty cool, and it's a very interesting read, I think. So I'm going to jump into some lessons learned now, and you can get some pretty pictures of some of the views that I had when I was living down there. First off, when you do the migration, you have to be aware of special characters. The limitations of special characters on-prem are different from the limitations of special characters in the cloud. Generally, it's better in the cloud. It accepts more special characters, but in some cases, it's not. Checked out files, if they have files that are checked out on-prem, they're actually sort of invisible to most tools that would do a migration for you. I will also say my personal opinion is that checkout, especially in SharePoint 2016 and SharePoint Online, I would love to have that button removed because it's totally counter to the idea of co-authoring where people can edit files at the same time. So I generally advise people to not use checked out files if they can. If you have missing users or people who have left the company, for example, that their account is deleted, but the data about them is still in existence in the history, the version history of a file, that is, I'd be surprised if you didn't have that. You actually have to usually give the destination SharePoint Online area like a dummy name because the name doesn't exist in Active Directory at that point. It's just sort of dummy data in SharePoint on-prem. So you have to keep that in mind when you're doing that. Restorations are by site collection. I mentioned that earlier. And I will also say I should probably add this now since this is new since when I actually did this project, is that Office 365 or SharePoint Online is really not meant to be a hierarchical setup any longer. We have a history on prem systems or on-prem systems where you'd have, site, subsite, sub-subsite, great-grandchild site, great-great-grandchild site. Microsoft is very much moving in the direction of a more a breadth and not depth. So every site itself would be a site collection. They exist wherever they exist. You interlink the way you need to, and you don't have to worry about long path lengths anymore. And one of the main reasons for that is because Office 365 groups, when you create a group, you get a site with it. It's actually a site collection, but you don't need your users to know that. And it is its own site collection. So it will not show up. You will not have the opportunity to create that site under, Teams/HR/benefits/2018 or something like that. You would have to, it would be its own existence living, sort of by itself, and you can interlink between things that way. So keep that in mind. Site collection, site collection, site collection. That's what's going to be important moving forward with Office 365. And as you start doing your migration, reconsider your information architecture. If you have a very hierarchical system, consider pulling sites out one by one, and when you migrate them, make them their own site collections and have a new menu system that connects all these things correctly. One of the solutions for that, because we don't really have sort of a roll-up tool in SharePoint out of the box, is these new hub sites. So hub sites are really meant to give the opportunity where if you live in HR or you're in the HR department, all of the HR sites can be accessed to and have content roll up to the HR hub site. And you can then bounce around regardless of permissions, and the hub site actually displays things based on your permissions. So keep that in mind. And then the other big thing here is, wow, do things change fast? They really, really do. So you just have to, the time that you were spending doing a lot more administrative work is going to be spent more digesting information and keeping up with the Joneses, which you may or may not like, so you have to kind of keep that in mind. I'll point out here too, the big thing about our lesson learned was the Exchange Online mailboxes are required to use Office 365 groups. So we had Exchange on-prem. My lesson learned was that we should have included the Exchange people in our project, because I didn't realize that you had to either migrate it to Exchange Online or at least provide Exchange Online mailboxes whenever a group is created. It's the group itself that needs the Exchange Online mailbox, not necessarily the users in that group. But that impacts Planner because every group gets a plan. That impacts Teams because a team in Microsoft Teams is an Office 365 group. It's going to impact Outlook because it creates a shared calendar and a shared inbox. And it's going to affect Yammer because Yammer creates a group. I'm now thinking. Yammer creates a group which includes things like Planner and Power BI Workspace, that infographic I had there. So if that thing depends on an Outlook or an Exchange existence, then it's going to require the Exchange Online connection. So long story short is, make sure that you include your Exchange people in your project planning on this, because it is critical if you want to get the most out of Exchange or out of Office 365 groups. You really can't do Office 365 groups with just SharePoint Online. Let's just say it that way. And that was a lesson learned for us that we did not expect to have to stumble through afterwards. A couple other things here to keep in mind. Logging in is now a must, which is kind of a downside. Back when you had your intranet on-prem, you just open up your browser and it goes there. Now you have to log in. I generally tell people just leave your browser open all day long and it won't make you log in all the time. Now that's a use case that a lot of people don't do, I found out the hard way, so people complained about that. Redirecting old sites and my sites, there is no simple way to do that. So you can't have, when you shut down one and start the, let's say Sunday night, you shut down the on-prem system and at the same time, you now add access and favorites and send that stuff out via policy to your users. There is no easy way to have a redirect on the old sites. So I generally pick the top 10 or 15 most populous sites in the on-prem system. I leave those on, and I disable every other site in the system. And I have an automatic, just inject some JavaScript where it takes 10 seconds and it says in big red letters, this has moved to this new link. You'll be redirected in 10 seconds. If you never want to see this page again, make sure to favorite that or get rid of this favorite in your browsers. Okay. Another minor thing, SMS alerts aren't supported. So if you use SharePoint alerts ever, there's an option on-prem to send it to your email, which is the default, or to your text your phone. We never really used that on-prem, but of course after we moved to online, I had a request for SMS alerts. They do not work. The option is there. It's grayed out. There's no way to turn it on. Microsoft has told me that they just don't support it any longer. They don't plan to, but they never pulled it out of the UI. One thing too, actually two things about the Waffle, the app launcher that's on the top left of your Office 365 experience, is that you can't really remove, or I guess you can remove your apps if you want to. The easiest way to do it is by removing a license to the specific application. So if you look at the licensing structure in AAD, under your E3, E5, E whatever you're using, or government system, you can yank that. That'll pull it away. The other way to do it is with PowerShell. I really don't PowerShell ever. So the fact that I have to do that for some cases is very annoying to me, because I'd rather just twist or switch a toggle. But keep that in mind. And then adding apps is also through PowerShell. You can do it. It's kind of annoying, but it's kind of nice to have. You can basically have the main links of anything that your employees would need. So you could have a link to your homepage, to ADP, or to your time system, to your health benefit system. Externally, I'm talking to some other cloud service or some other website. So that's kind of nice out there too. And then you get all the other benefits of cloud services, and I'll point out here, kind of like bots. So this example here is actually a bot that I have that that we rolled out. You can actually put this right into a SharePoint site. So this is sort of a nice way of supplementing both. You have a site structure with all of your documents, right? Every single file is there, let's say, and even if it's not well organized, you might be able to find it through your metadata or folder structure, or you can use search, but it's organic, and you can't really amend it so that you can force people to get to the right places by certain terms. You can use SharePoint search refiners to filter down, or you can actually use best bets in 2010 or promoted results in 2013 or SharePoint Online. But I'm looking up the word benefits. I want the 2018 benefits document to pop up. Well, actually, with bots, what's nice is that you can actually have people just ask directly, provide them an answer that you know is vetted and is correct, and link back to the source. And the benefit here is that the bot actually gives you the answer. So this example here asks, how much sick time do I, how does sick time roll over? Gives you all the information on rolling over time, and it links back to the employee handbook if you want to see the source, but it gives you the answer. So if you go to search something in SharePoint Search, it's rare when you actually get the answer from search. You might get the source of the answer, but if the source of the answer is a 200-page employee handbook, you're then going to have to go search for that PDF or that Word doc, and search is smart enough that it can do fuzzy searches. So looking up the word rollover versus roll time over is easy for search to do, but once you open up the file and you want to do a Control F to find the actual term rollover, the word rollover may not actually be there anywhere. It may be roll time over and you don't know any better. So you're kind of looking through a PDF in the same way that you'd look through a papered or a stapled packet of paper in 1995. So I think this is a really great way to provide people access to information that's requested frequently. It saves people time on like the HR, IT side, anybody who gets the same question over and over again, and you can actually incorporate existing facts, FAQs, without having to do a whole lot of work. So anyway, that's just a quick plug on some of the services you can get here, because bots are now the thing, and it really is going to be a thing. It's not just going to blow over as some sort of fad. It's definitely not that, and this is a good example of how you can apply that for real. Okay, and then I think the biggest takeaway here you have to keep in mind, and it's one of the harder things for technical folks, especially in IT, is that change management and communication aren't just part of the process, they are the process. You have to get a hold of everybody in every way that they take part. One of the best change management processes I've been through is with a client recently where they had signs up in the cafeteria. When the new intranet rolled out, they had signs up at the on the counters, even in the bathrooms. They had the heads up coming for weeks ahead of time. They asked for input. We had design reviews done by general people, because if you involve them, they actually have some sense of ownership over it. Doing actual meetings with different organizations to ask them how they work right now. So, do you email generally back and forth? Do you hate when you have email attachments? Well, here's the SharePoint thing. Even if you have a bad taste left in your mouth from a previous SharePoint experience, this might actually be a little bit better. But you have to keep that going with that, and the project doesn't end just because you've rolled out the new system. The project goes on because you have to continue with change management and communication, definitely. So the takeaway here, I talked about there were 4 people full-time working on this, plus some part-time folks. In the end, because you want to talk about, is this going to save us money? It was me. I was still the knowledge manager. 1 full-time developer / admin. So 2 of those other guys are no longer necessary after we did the rollout. And we had one of those guys ended up staying on call with us as a contract employee whenever we needed it. So the full-time, or the personnel necessary to keep control over this was cut in half. And that was a major savings for us, even considering that you're paying for a subscription service for Office 365. But if we had migrated up to 2016, that would have been a new license for us to purchase for all 175 people for however many years we're going to have it. So it was a major major boon for us. All right. So my conclusion is super simple. It was worth it for the move to the cloud. Not everybody. Lots and lots of places are looking at the cloud that might surprise you, even national security organizations in DC. I was just at Microsoft Tech Summit the last couple days this week, and that was a government summit. So talking to some of those people who work for DoD or NSA or other high security organizations, if they're considering a move to the cloud and you are concerned about security, I don't really think that concern is all that warranted. You should do your research, but you should not be too concerned. And I think generally speaking, a subscription service that provides minor changes every so often is way easier to administer, is more productive, more efficient, so you don't have to take a whole group of 2 to 10 people off of their other project once every 3 years or once every 6 years when you do an upgrade. I think that's a good lesson learned too, and kind of go from that. So I am going to take some questions. I see a couple here that I missed, and I apologize, so I will jump onto those. So which SharePoint role is required to see the files that are not shared with you while migrating using ShareGate? So independent of ShareGate, the reference I was making there was about checked out files, and checked out files by default are basically a secret existence to just the person that has it checked out, even if it is in SharePoint. So the file itself won't be available to a migration tool unless any of those tools have gotten over that hurdle. But that was one that all of them had to deal with. So you had to go through, and you can get a report out of all those checked out files from a tool like ShareGate or a competitor. But you have to go out to the user and either ask them to check it in. It's not going to be a very good day if the person is left, or you just accept the fact that it never got migrated over. For SMS alerts, I thought it was removed because they have something in Azure accessible via Flow to do such a thing. That's probably true. You do get Microsoft Flow with Office 365. It's just annoying to me that the UI was never changed, so it's just a grayed out radio button if I wanted to send to a text message. And it just kind of irked me because it gave somebody that that was a very heavy user of my SharePoint system and was always the one kind of poking me with feature requests and said, oh, this is great. I can now get, my boss can now get text messages whenever an alert comes out, and that was not the case. But you're probably right. Flow can probably do that in an automated fashion, but you'd have to build the flow, which is not super technical, but you do have to go out and do it yourself. Let's see. By coincidence, I'm going to the Caribbean with my family next week. Enjoy. I hope you have a good time. Let's see. I like the idea of a mandatory training course for external sharing. Is a fantastic idea that seems to be the biggest pain point in our rollout SPO so far. Would you happen to have an outline of your course that you could share with us? It's not so much a course, but the handout that goes along with this, lucky for you, actually includes the handout that goes normally with my external sharing session. So you actually get all of that for the price of, well, none, I guess, $0. So you get both. Let's see. So is it required to take the organization to Office 365/Exchange in order to get to SharePoint Online? Let's see. I guess it depends on how I define required to take. But I guess my intended takeaway here is that you can move to SharePoint Online no problem, right? It's doable. You just have to know that there are other tools that if you have them on premises, you really need to do a review of whether or not they need to have to go on-prem, and you can talk to your Microsoft rep about it and get that information. I will say I don't generally deal with Exchange. Actually, I don't ever. But I have heard from a number of people who do that kind of work that Exchange is the easier one to do first. So whether or not we knew that at the time, we didn't. We still went to SPO because it was time to do an upgrade for SharePoint because I was directed to do that. That was one of the reasons I was hired. And the Exchange team had plenty of other stuff. They were not just working on Exchange. They were in charge of AD on-prem. They were in charge of the file shares. They were our server and network guys, basically. So they had a lot on their plate, so they did not actually do that. They were not ready to do any sort of Exchange Online upgrade at the time. So, is there any official recommendations for number of SharePoint personnel for both migration and post-migration? Yeah, you say based on size of organization, and that is absolutely true, based on the size of the organization. I spent most of my time with change management. That was my role. My 3 devs that were working on this, and devs/admins, one of them was doing all of the test migrations. The nice cool thing was the first test migration we did, which cost us nothing, gave us basically de facto disaster recovery back to that date, which was kind of cool. And the other 2 guys were working on the app updates. So we had some workflows. Our homepage was totally custom developed right before I had gotten there, so we had to rebuild it completely in SharePoint Online, which was kind of a pain. But yeah, it really does come down to the size of the organization. If you're talking about, I was talking to one government organization this week, and they said that they have like 1.4 petabytes of data. And they said, oh, so how do we do that migration? I said, the first thing you do is you clean house. Unfortunately, there is no technical way to just do a drag and drop. Well, actually, I'm not going to say unfortunately. I'm going to say fortunately, because it's a really good opportunity. It's like when you move houses. You should not just move everything into the new house. You should take the opportunity to clean up, reorganize, decide whether or not you actually need that thing, or was that junk drawer just collecting crap that you were never going to use again anyway. People don't like to do that, and I totally get it, but you kind of have to. And if people complain about search results, I have an infographic out on best uses of search in SharePoint, both 2013 and online. And step one, if you want better search, is to get rid of all the stuff that you don't need any longer. If you have benefits documents dating back to 2015, like either save them in a folder that only the benefits team has access to for historical record, or delete the file. An easy way to do that is to put retention periods on those files based on legal requirements or recommendations from your legal department. And there are a lot of services like that that come with Office 365 that I didn't even realize. Retention labels on timing, so having something delete at the right time. I believe that comes with an Enterprise E3 license, for example. You should look at the security and mobility licensing. There's an E3 version of that and an E5. You can use data loss prevention. So if you have external sharing enabled in OneDrive, even individual OneDrive users' accounts, or SharePoint, even individual sites or site collections, you can have it so that anything that has certain terms in it, if it's HIPAA related, financial, personal and private information, that kind of stuff, if it does a scan and sees that kind of data in there, it'll actually stop you from being able to share it externally. So there are a lot of other tools that come with Office 365 for either the same price that you're already paying or for very minimal on top of that. Okay, this is a huge question, but do you have some quick tips for deploying a hybrid configuration? I've never done hybrid. I really dislike the idea of hybrid. So I'm not going to try to give you any tips on something that I am sort of deep down inside against. I realize there are use cases for it, but I think my first reaction to every request about hybrid is always, do you really have to do hybrid? Because it's really difficult to do it right. It's just the user interface thing. If you have to tell people that there's 2 different SharePoint versions and potentially even 2 different OneDrive versions, and they have to understand the difference, and the coloring of one is this, and then you get into accessibility and if somebody's colorblind, and there are a lot of really detailed questions that can be a pain. Let's see. More like, why would you not move to Exchange Online? Let's see. For development, which version should I purchase? Well, for development purposes, you're going to be doing that in. You can be doing it in SharePoint Designer, I guess, but that would be probably Visual Studio type of thing. So I think that, because again, I don't develop, but I believe that kind of stuff is what you do on your local system and then upload into SharePoint to do your testing. Oh, the other nice thing too is, like I said, we had dev, staging, test, and prod. That concept is totally out the window. It doesn't exist anymore. If you need an area to go do testing, create a new site collection. When you're done, delete it. Right? There is no such thing as production any longer. Right? Every site collection is its own thing. It just exists, and each one of them can be deleted or can remain. You just call it what you want to, and you're good for there. Any suggested alternative to email-enabled lists for SPO? I do not have any suggested alternative for that. I believe that, I think you're asking because I believe that functionality no longer exists, which is a shame, although I will say I never actually really used it in the past. That being said, that's sort of what Office Groups is for, or for at least Outlook Groups is for, because the membership of that team or that site is the same membership that has the Outlook Group access. If you guys want, you can actually scroll through my Twitter feed right now. I actually have a recent basics of Office 365 group session that I did with a user group in the last couple weeks. I can tweet it out again after this if you want to follow me. So within the 15 minutes of finishing this, I can actually put that up there. But yeah, it's sort of I guess I don't know the full functionality of what enabled lists were like on-prem, but I think most of the functionality is covered by Outlook Groups. But you do have to understand that you're going to have some changes there. People are going to have to understand that the user interface or the experience is going to be a little bit different. If you have on-prem SP applications, you may need hybrid for a period of time. That is absolutely true. Yes, I did not explicitly state that, although I was implying it. And the hybrid in this case is not so much about you need to be on SharePoint on-prem versus SharePoint Online. That's more of a, generally speaking, and I can be wrong and your specific use case could be different, but when somebody is going to a certain application, they generally know the application by the application's name or its sort of brand, and you don't have to try to keep people in mind of, okay, you need to be in SharePoint Online for this thing and SharePoint on-prem for that. Users really shouldn't have to know the difference. So you're right. It is easy to get all of your content, easier to get your content in SPO and work on your applications and one at a time upload them. But when you're going to these applications, they're usually links anyway, so you're just updating a menu. So the menu link will point to wherever it's supposed to go, and the user is sort of none the wiser. But that is a very good point. Thank you for pointing that out. So that's the last question and comment I have here, I think. So I think I'm a couple minutes under time. No, I am right on time, actually.
Right on time, actually. Yeah.
Perfect.
This was perfect. Perfect timing, actually, on your part. I think it went really smoothly. So thanks very much for doing this, Matt.
Yeah, sounds good, and I appreciate it. Anybody has any questions, comments, my contact information is, I think I have it here. Oh, and I know that you guys request feedback, and I love feedback, so anything that helps you guys out, please do that. This is my contact info. Feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn. I accept any requests. I'm not picky there, and I put a lot of content out on Twitter, and feel free to email me if you're interested. That's my email address right there.
Wonderful.